relic of power. Ellie sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor of the archives, surrounded by stacks of brittle tomes and yellowed manuscripts. Flickering candlelight danced across the vaulted ceiling as she scanned page after page, her mind racing to connect the fragments of history she had uncovered. The artifact sat on a nearby table, its jagged edges and faintly glowing symbols casting an ominous presence over the room. Ellie could feel its energy, a pulsing hum that seemed to resonate in her bones. Callum sat on a bench across from her, sharpening a crowbar he'd found, his makeshift preparation for any further attacks from the shadows. Dr. Royce, still pale from his earlier encounter, pored over a centuries-old ledger, his fingers tracing the faded ink. "This is madness," Royce muttered, breaking the silence. "We're risking our lives over a relic that might not even have a solution." Ellie looked up from her notes, her expression resolute. "It's more than a relic. It's the heart of everything. The activity, the curse, even the castle itself. It all leads back to this." Royce sighed and adjusted his glasses. "What exactly are you looking for?" Ellie hesitated, then pointed to the artifact. "A connection. Something that explains why this thing exists, what it's tied to, and how it's managed to haunt this place for centuries. The monarchy's ties." Ellie flipped through a thick volume bound in cracked leather, its spine barely holding together. Her breath caught as she came across an entry marked with an elaborate crest, a lion rampant, the symbol of Scotland's monarchy. "Listen to this," Ellie said, her voice tinged with excitement. "It's a record from the reign of James I. It mentions a crown that was forged with an artifact said to contain the wrath of an ancient force." Callum leaned forward. "Wrath of an ancient force? That sounds comforting." Ellie continued reading, her fingers skimming the text. "The crown was meant to protect Scotland's rulers, but there was a condition. The monarchs had to govern justly and uphold the land's ancient traditions. If they didn't, the artifact's power would turn against them, bringing ruin to their reign." Royce frowned, leaning closer. "Are you saying this artifact was part of the crown jewels?" Ellie nodded, "or at least tied to them. The records are fragmented, but it sounds like the artifact was separated from the crown centuries ago, possibly to prevent its curse from spreading further." Callum gestured toward the glowing relic on the table. "So, what? This thing has been sitting down here, waiting for someone to mess with it?" Ellie shook her head. "Not waiting. The castle's activity, the spirits, the whispers, the attacks, it's all been building towards something. I think the artifact wants to be reunited with the crown. The curse unfolds." Royce stood and paced, his brow furrowed in thought. "The crown? If what you're saying is true, that means the artifact's curse didn't just affect the castle. It could have shaped Scotland's entire history." Ellie nodded. "Wars, betrayals, plagues. What if they weren't just human failures? What if the artifact's power influenced them, feeding on the despair and chaos?" Callum frowned. "Then why now? Why is it waking up after all this time?" Ellie hesitated, her gaze drifting back to the artifact. "Maybe it's because of us. We disturbed it. Or maybe the castle's pain, its sentience, has reached a breaking point, and the artifact is using that to manifest its power." Royce ran a hand through his hair, his scholarly skepticism wavering. "If the artifact is truly tied to the monarchy, there must be more written about it. Legends, prophecies, something that tells us how to break the curse." Ellie pulled out another manuscript, this one filled with dense script and intricate illustrations. She flipped to a page depicting a crown encircled by flames, its jagged edges identical to the artifact's design. Beneath it was a single phrase, written in Latin: "Regnum superbus cadet, solemn humilis tolent maledictionem." "The proud kingdom shall fall, only the humble shall lift the curse." Ellie translated aloud. Royce's face paled, a prophecy tied to humility. A dangerous notion for monarchs who often lived and died by their pride. An unraveled past. As they pieced together the artifact's history, a picture began to emerge. The crown, imbued with the artifact's power, had been meant as a symbol of unity and strength. But its curse was a double-edged sword. Monarchs who ruled with hubris and cruelty unwittingly unleashed the artifact's wrath, resulting in civil unrest, invasions, and even mysterious deaths within the royal line. Ellie traced a timeline in her notebook, noting key events. The brutal executions during the Black Dinner, the disappearance of the Piper beneath the castle, the sealing of plague victims in the vaults. All of these events, Ellie said, pointing to the timeline, happened during times of corruption and strife. The artifact wasn't just a passive object. It was actively punishing the kingdom. Callum crossed his arms, his face grim. So what happens if we don't stop it? What's the endgame? Ellie glanced at the glowing relic, its light pulsing faintly in the dim room. If the curse reaches full strength, it won't just stay in the castle. It could spread, fueling chaos across Scotland, or worse, the Crown's secret chamber. Royce, now fully invested in their research, leaned over the table and tapped a section of the map. "There's one place we haven't looked yet," he said. "The royal chamber beneath the Great Hall. It was sealed centuries ago, but it was rumored to hold treasures and secrets tied to the monarchy." Ellie's eyes lit up. If the crown is still there, we might be able to figure out how to use it to neutralize the artifact. Callum groaned. "Of course it's in the one place no one's been able to get into." Royce smirked. "Well, you did manage to open the vaults. I have faith in your unconventional methods." The descent. The trio made their way to the Great Hall, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Ellie carried the artifact carefully, its weight heavy in her hands. Not just physically, but with the knowledge of the destruction it had caused. Royce led them to a section of the hall where the floor was marked with faint outlines of a trapdoor. The edges were worn smooth, and the stone was covered in dust, but the faint Latin inscription etched into its surface was still legible. "Quod unit regis regnum destruit." What unites kings destroys the kingdom. "That's ominous," Callum muttered. Royce examined the edges of the trapdoor. "This should be a mechanism to open it." "Ah, here." He pressed a carved lion's head on the nearby wall, and the floor trembled as the trapdoor groaned open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "After you," Royce said, gesturing to Ellie. Ellie rolled her eyes but took the lead, her flashlight cutting through the inky blackness. The air grew colder as they descended, and the faint sound of whispers echoed up from below. The relic room. The staircase ended in a circular chamber, its walls lined with shelves holding ancient artifacts and crumbling scrolls. At the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and atop it rested a crown. The crown was exquisite yet menacing, its jagged edges gleaming in the faint light. The symbols etched into its surface matched those on the artifact, their patterns glowing faintly as Ellie approached. "It's here," Ellie said softly. She placed the artifact on the pedestal beside the crown, and the room erupted with energy. The crown and artifact pulsed in unison, their glow intensifying until the symbols on the walls came alive, casting the chamber in a kaleidoscope of light. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and Ellie fell to her knees, clutching her head as visions flooded her mind. A king kneeling in shame, his crown discarded, a castle consumed by fire, its stones weeping blood, a field of peace, the land finally at rest. The whispers fell silent, leaving Ellie gasping for breath. She looked up at the crown and artifact, their light dimming as if awaiting her next move. "It's waiting," Ellie said. "It wants us to make a choice." A dark history unveiled. The chamber beneath the Great Hall seemed to pulsate with an unseen energy. The artifact and the crown glowed faintly on the stone pedestal, their etched symbols alive with an eerie, shifting light. Ellie sat cross-legged on the cold floor, her notebook open in her lap as she tried to make sense of the fragmented visions that had flooded her mind moments before. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on the room. Callum and Dr. Royce stood nearby, their faces etched with unease as they waited for Ellie to speak. "It all makes sense now," Ellie said finally, her voice steady but tinged with awe. "Care to enlighten us?" Callum asked, his arms crossed. Ellie gestured to the crown and artifact. "The curse, it's not just a punishment. It's a cycle. Every tragedy that's happened in this castle, every ghost that's bound here, is connected to it." Royce adjusted his glasses, his scholarly curiosity overtaking his earlier fear. A cycle of what, exactly? Ellie's gaze drifted to the crown. Of power, betrayal, and despair. The curse wasn't just meant to punish kings. It's tied to the castle itself. Every time someone abuses power here, every time an injustice is committed, the curse feeds on it. It traps the victim's souls and uses their pain to fuel its own strength. The ghost stories. Ellie began flipping through her notebook, pointing to the key events she had documented. Take the Black Dinner, for example. The Douglas brothers were invited here under the guise of peace, only to be betrayed and executed. Their fear, their anger, their betrayal. It all became part of the curse. Royce nodded slowly, and the plague victims sealed in the vaults. Ellie's expression darkened. Another act of cruelty. They were left to die in agony, abandoned and forgotten. Their suffering didn't just linger. It was absorbed by the castle, adding to its power. Callum frowned. And the Piper? He wasn't even royalty. Why did the curse take him? Ellie hesitated, then pointed to the artifact. Because he got too close. The tunnels he explored, they were part of the castle's foundation, part of the curse's network. When he entered, he became a part of it, just like everyone else. The room fell silent as the weight of Ellie's words sank in. The castle wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, holding the souls of its victims captive in an endless cycle of torment. Visions of the past. Ellie placed her hand on the pedestal, the cold stone, sending a shiver up her spine. The artifact and crown pulsed faintly beneath her touch, and she closed her eyes, bracing herself for the flood of images she knew would come. In an instant, she was pulled into the castle's past. She saw the great hall filled with nobles, their laughter turning to screams as soldiers stormed the room during the Black Dinner. She felt the fear of the Douglas brothers, their desperate cries echoing as they were dragged to their deaths. The vision shifted to the vaults, where plague victims huddled in the darkness, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. She heard their whispered prayers, their voices growing weaker as the days stretched into weeks. Then, she was in the tunnels, following the Piper as he descended into the darkness. She felt his growing fear as the melody of his bagpipes faltered, the shadows closing in around him. Finally, she stood in the castle courtyard, watching as a king knelt before the crown, his hands trembling as he placed it on his head. The moment the crown touched him, the air around him seemed to darken, and a faint, mournful wail filled the air. The visions ended abruptly, leaving Ellie gasping for breath. The curse's purpose. It's a balance, Ellie said, her voice trembling as she tried to make sense of what she had seen. The curse wasn't just meant to destroy. It was meant to preserve. Callum raised an eyebrow. Preserve what? The world's worst haunted house. Ellie shook her head. The castle. The crown. Scotland's monarchy. The curse was created to protect them, but it became corrupted. Instead of keeping the kingdom safe, it started punishing anyone who got too close. Anyone who disturbed its balance. Royce frowned. And now that balance has been shattered, Ellie nodded. Exactly. The castle is overflowing with centuries of pain and suffering. It's reached a breaking point, and the curse is lashing out. That's why the activity has been escalating. It's trying to release the energy it's been holding. Callum gestured to the artifact. So, what do we do? Destroy this thing? Ellie hesitated, her gaze fixed on the crown and artifact. I don't think we can. The curse is too deeply embedded in the castle. But maybe we can break the cycle. The ghost's release. Ellie turned back to the crown, her fingers brushing over its jagged edges. The symbols etched into its surface pulsed faintly, as though responding to her touch. We have to reunite the crown and artifact, she said. It's the only way to stabilize the curse. Royce's eyes widened. You can't be serious. If the curse is tied to the crown, reuniting them could amplify its power, not diminish it. Ellie shook her head. Not if we do it the right way. The prophecy said, only the humble shall lift the curse. It's not just about the objects. It's about the intent behind them. If we approach this with the right mindset, we might be able to free the spirits trapped here and break the curse's hold on the castle. Callum groaned. And if we're wrong? Ellie met his gaze, her expression resolute. Then we'll deal with whatever comes next. But we have to try. A desperate gamble. With Royce and Callum's reluctant help, Ellie carefully lifted the artifact and placed it atop the crown. The moment the two objects touched, the room was filled with a blinding light. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, their voices forming a cacophony of pain and anger. The walls of the chamber trembled, and the floor beneath them cracked, sending jagged lines of light radiating outward. Ellie knelt before the pedestal, her hands clasped in a silent prayer. "We're here to end this," she whispered. "Not for power, but for peace. For the lives you've taken, and the ones you've trapped." The whispers began to fade, replaced by a low, mournful hum. The light around the crown and artifact softened, and the cracks in the floor began to mend. Ellie felt a wave of relief wash over her as the oppressive weight of the curse began to lift. A castle at rest. As the energy in the room subsided, Ellie opened her eyes to find the chamber bathed in a soft, golden glow. The artifact and crown no longer pulsed with power. They were silent, their symbols faded. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound silence that felt almost peaceful. "It's over," Ellie said softly. Callum let out a shaky laugh. "I can't believe that actually worked." Royce adjusted his glasses, his expression a mix of awe and exhaustion. "You may have just rewritten history, Miss Cartwright." Ellie stood, her gaze lingering on the crown. "We didn't just rewrite it," she said. "We set it free." The castle seemed to exhale, its walls no longer groaning under the weight of centuries of pain. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, it was at peace. The dilemma. Ellie stared at the artifact resting atop the jagged crown. The once brilliant glow of its symbols had dimmed, but the weight of its presence still filled the room. It radiated a quiet, malevolent power, as though it were waiting, daring her to make a choice. Behind her, Callum and Dr. Royce stood in tense silence, their faces pale in the flickering light. The decision was hers to make, but the implications felt insurmountable. Destroying the relic might sever the curse once and for all, or it might unleash the full wrath of the spirits trapped within the castle. Ellie clenched her fists, her mind racing. The spirits' voices still echoed faintly in her ears, an endless chorus of anguish and rage. She couldn't shake the feeling that their suffering was bound to the relic, a tether that kept them trapped in the castle's dark history. "Ellie," Callum said softly, breaking the silence. "Whatever you're thinking, we need to decide now. This place is barely holding together." The argument. Ellie turned to face them, her voice trembling. "If we destroy it, we might break the curse. But what if we're wrong? What if it releases them instead?" Callum crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. "And leaving it here is any better? Look at what this thing has done. The whispers, the attacks, the visions. This castle is alive because of it." Royce adjusted his glasses, his scholarly demeanor wavering. "You're both missing the larger issue. This relic isn't just some malevolent trinket. It's a part of Scotland's history. Destroying it would erase a piece of our heritage, no matter how dark it may be." Ellie glared at him. "You didn't see what I saw. The lives this thing has taken, the pain it's caused. It's not just history, it's a weapon. And weapons are neutral," Royce countered. "It's the intent behind them that defines their use. Perhaps the curse can be rebalanced without resorting to destruction." Callum threw up his hands. "So we just leave it here and hope for the best?" "Great plan, document. Let's see how that works when the next group of explorers stumbles in and ends up on the wrong side of the castle." The spirits speak. As the argument escalated, the air in the chamber grew colder, and the faint glow of the artifact and crown intensified. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, their overlapping voices forming fragmented sentences. "Balance broken. Pain release. Freedom destroy." Ellie froze, her heart pounding as she listened. The spirits weren't just reacting, they were pleading. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Callum nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, and I don't think they're on the same page as us." Royce frowned. "It seems they're divided, just as we are. Some want release, while others seem to fear destruction." Ellie stepped closer to the pedestal, her gaze fixed on the relic. What if destroying it doesn't release them? What if it traps them here forever? Or sets them free to wreak havoc, Callum said grimly. Ellie closed her eyes, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like the stones of the castle itself. Weighing the options, Ellie knelt beside the pedestal, her fingers brushing the cool, jagged edges of the artifact. The visions it had shown her, the Piper's terror, the plague victim's despair, the betrayal of the Douglas brothers, flashed through her mind. The relic had absorbed centuries of pain, becoming a repository of the castle's darkest moments. But it wasn't the only victim. The spirits trapped within its grasp were caught in an endless cycle of suffering, their voices echoing in the stones around her. She turned to Royce. If we leave it untouched, the curse stays intact. The castle keeps feeding on the pain, and the spirits remain trapped. Right? Royce hesitated, then nodded. Most likely. But it might also prevent the curse from spreading beyond the castle walls. As long as it's contained, its power is limited. Ellie looked to Callum. And if we destroy it? Callum shrugged, his expression grim. Best case, the spirits are freed, and the curse is broken. Worst case, we unleash whatever's inside that thing, and it makes everything worse. Ellie sighed, her gaze returning to the relic. So it's a gamble either way. A ghostly interruption. As Ellie deliberated, a shadowy figure materialized at the edge of the chamber. It was the Piper, his translucent form flickering like a dying flame. His hollow eyes met Ellie's, and he raised a hand, pointing to the relic. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice trembling. The Piper didn't speak, but his mournful expression seemed to convey his answer. He gestured to the crown and artifact, then to himself, his movements slow and deliberate. He's tied to it, Ellie said softly. If we destroy it, we destroy him. Callum frowned. And if we don't, he stays trapped. The Piper lowered his hand, his form flickering more intensely. His lips moved silently, but Ellie could feel his message. Do what must be done. The decision. Ellie stood, her mind racing as the Piper faded back into the shadows. She turned to Royce and Callum, her expression resolute. We can't leave it here, she said. The castle will never stop. The spirits will never be free. We have to destroy it. Callum nodded slowly. Okay, but how? Ellie glanced around the chamber, her eyes landing on a rusted iron sledgehammer leaning against the wall. She grabbed it, the weight familiar and grounding in her hands. Royce stepped forward, his face etched with concern. Are you sure about this? Once it's gone, there's no undoing it. Ellie met his gaze. This isn't just about history, Alan. It's about justice, for the Piper, for the plague victims, for everyone this curse has hurt. Royce sighed but stepped back, his expression somber. Do it then. End this. Breaking the relic. Ellie raised the sledgehammer, her muscles tensing as she prepared to strike. The relic and crown pulsed one final time, their glow brightening as if in protest. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, anguished chorus. Freedom, destruction, balance. With a cry, Ellie brought the sledgehammer down on the relic. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, the artifact shattering into jagged fragments that scattered across the floor. The whispers ceased instantly, replaced by an eerie, all-encompassing silence. The glow of the crown faded, and the air in the chamber grew still. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the walls began to tremble, and a low, mournful wail echoed through the castle, rising from its very foundations. The aftermath. The trembling stopped as suddenly as it had begun, and the oppressive weight that had filled the castle lifted. Ellie sank to her knees, the sledgehammer slipping from her grasp. It's over, she whispered. Callum knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? Ellie nodded, though tears streamed down her face. I think they're free. All of them. Royce stepped forward, his gaze lingering on the shattered relic. You may have done more than free the spirits, he said softly. You've given this place a chance to heal. Ellie looked up at him, her expression resolute. No more pain. No more fear. The curse ends here. As they climbed the staircase back to the Great Hall, Ellie felt a strange sense of peace. The castle, once alive with anguish and despair, now seemed quiet, almost serene. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their actions had set something else in motion, a ripple that would spread far beyond the castle walls.